Well, hello and welcome to our latest FlightGlobal webinar, Crisis in the Cockpit, How the Pandemic Has Impacted Pilots. 12 short months ago, to be an airline pilot was to be part of a professional elite that hundreds of thousands of young people the world over aspired to. Aviation was booming and aviators were in demand. Now, the profession did not come without its challenges. There was stress, occasional problems with management, and yes, some job insecurity too. But generally, there were more vacancies for experienced pilots than there were pilots to fill them. In the first half of 2020, all that changed. COVID-19 wreaked havoc on the industry, and pilots found themselves surplus to requirements, facing, many for the first time in their career, the prospect of not being able to fly for a living. As we enter 2021, despite the encouraging news about the vaccine, the situation for the world's airlines and pilots remains highly uncertain. Now, it's easy to talk in terms of big numbers when it comes to pilots that have been hit by this crisis, but every one of these individuals has their own story to tell of shattered dreams, financial worries, disappointment and dismay, and occasionally optimism in the midst of the gloom. Now, towards the end of last year, our partners GOOSE Recruitment surveyed more than 2,600 of them to provide an exclusive snapshot into the way pilots have been affected, how they're thinking, and what they plan to do now. It's a follow-on from a survey we carried out 12 months earlier, a time that could hardly be more different in terms of the environment that pilots find themselves in now. So to discuss the findings and what they mean for the sector, I'm joined by two guests from GOOSE Recruitment, founder and chief executive Mark Charman and Samantha Wilson, who's head of executive search and aviation recruitment. But just before we hear from them, a reminder that this is a live webinar and we welcome your questions. So please use the Q&A icon on your Zoom dashboard at the bottom, and we'll get through as many of these as we can within the next 58 minutes or so. So Samantha, if I can start with you, we all know that this pandemic has had a dramatic effect on pilot employee numbers. What exactly does the survey show us?
It really has had a dramatic effect on employee numbers, Murdo, and the survey highlights this, breaking down the segments of unemployment, furlough, and redundancies. But firstly, a little introduction from myself. I'm Samantha, and I head up the team at GOOSE Recruitment. We're a specialist aviation recruiter covering all aspects of the aviation sector, including our experienced pilot recruitment team. As just touched on by Murdo, the global aviation market is experiencing one of the biggest challenges of its time, the COVID-19 pandemic. Few sectors have been hit harder than aviation, and we have never seen a period quite like it. The impact of the year on aviation recruitment trends have been significant, which is why GOOSE Recruitment and FlightGlobal have worked in partnership for a consecutive year to create a unique survey to establish how the events of 2020 have impacted the global pilot recruitment market. The Pilot Survey 2021 was open for 4 weeks and closed on the 30th of October 2020. So this is just before the vaccine has been approved. A total of 2,600 pilots took part in this survey, which was interestingly a huge increase on our survey completed in 2020, the previous year. The survey has been completed by all ranks, from newly qualified pilots that have achieved less than 500 hours and experienced pilots that have achieved way over 10,000 hours. So there was a really diverse pool of pilots involved in the survey. Our report aims to highlight and establish trends which contain sections covering employment rates, pay, job seeking and retention, very importantly, mental health, and of course, the future of aviation and pilots themselves. The data collected in this survey represents a huge cross-section of the marketplace. Pilots from across the globe participated in the survey from every region. While some findings were expected, such as 84% of pilots that are currently unemployed answered that this is due to the pandemic, There were also some very surprising and interesting stats from the survey that we'll be discussing in a bit more detail today. On that note, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone listening today that participated in our survey. Thank you. Throughout the survey, crucial questions were asked, such as which pilots are still employed and flying? Who is unemployed? Are unemployed pilots in a recruitment process currently? And do pilots feel valued? Of course, some elements of the survey were disheartening for myself and the team to read through comments, but we felt it was important and a very important platform for pilots to be heard and express those feelings. Personally, speaking to pilots themselves on a day basis, they've been in a career for 20 years with a particular airline and they generally enjoy getting up and going to work. They have now lost their jobs. It's been very difficult. However, after quite the year for the aviation industry and pilots in particular, I'm pleased to personally now be experiencing more positive engagement with our aviation partners and airlines. For the past year, as you can appreciate, speaking with airlines and clients, there's been some pretty bleak conversations, unable to comment on the future and certainly not the pilot projection plans. However, with agreed vaccines and airport safety measures being rolled out globally, airlines are now beginning marketing campaigns for the summer and winter, showing shoots of recovery. I'm certainly feeling we're turning a corner in the last few weeks in the conversations that are taking place and I'm having. The speed of recovery of aviation will of course be important. However, again, I'm experiencing opinions that the recovery will be more rapid than expected. 2020 has been a year of survival for aviation, and 2021 will be, I'm sure, the year of the initial recovery.
Well, thank you, Samantha, on that optimistic note, at least to end with. Mark, this study really gives us some remarkable insights into the way pilots are responding to this catastrophe. And you're going to talk now, I think, about some of the aspects of the survey that most surprised you.
Yes, thank you, Murdo, and thank you, Sam, for your excellent introduction. I'm going to share my screen with you now, so hopefully we're going to get a presentation up here. So we should have a presentation. Is that showing now? Yep, very good. So first of all, welcome everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for attending our webinar. I'm Mark Charman. I'm the CEO of the Farstream and the GOOSE Group, so GOOSE Recruitment, aviation and pilot recruitment. I'm not a pilot, I think that's the first thing to say. I know enough about flying to be dangerous, and the last time I flew an aeroplane was a chipmunk years and years ago in the air training course, so I'm definitely not a pilot. However, I have worked in recruitment for the last 30 years, and I've been through quite a few big downturns. None quite like this, but seen a few of these before, and hopefully I'll bring some of my experience to bear on today's presentation. Please, please, please ask Sam and I questions as we go through today. Now's your opportunity. I think we had some 650 people sign up for the webinar, so hopefully there'll be some really good questions, and we'll do our best, as Murdo said, to get through those today. So when we were going to run this report, we discussed whether or not, first of all, given the pandemic and the crisis, should we actually run the report at all? Or should we put it on hold? And we talked to our good friends at FlightGlobal and we discussed it, and we actually decided that now probably it was more important than ever before that we run the report and we share an insight into the thoughts, the feelings of pilots, and really share with you what we see is happening, and share with all of you what you tell us is happening in the industry as a whole. So this was a global survey, a big report. We surveyed some 2,600 people. There's a lot to cover. I'm not going to attempt to go through everything with you today. I'm really going to go through the headlines of this and try and bring it to life. Quite a lot of statistics. I'm going to move fairly quickly through the report, and as I say, I'm going to try and sort of share with you some of the key findings. So first of all, let's hit you with a big statistic that is a bit shocking. All right, let's see if we can go through first of all. So you told us that 57% of you are currently not flying. So even the people who are employed or furloughed, still not flying. Big statistic, huge. Some pilots tell us that it will be soon approaching a year since they last flew an aircraft. So this is a horrible statistic, but what it really does do is it gives you an insight into what's happening out there in the sector. I don't think there's been a time, certainly in living memory, when such a large percentage of pilots have not been flying. So the next statistic I'd like to share with you is that 30% of you told us that you're unemployed. So 17% of you are still employed, but furloughed. So furloughed, for those of you who are not in the UK, so this is essentially receiving government help, government assistance, while still employed, but not working. So 17% of you are employed, but currently furloughed. Some of you have taken whatever work you can get. Back in the first lockdown, earlier last year, it was very well reported in the mainstream press about a Ryanair pilot, Ben Andrews, and unfortunately Ben had lost his job and very quickly moved across to work for Tesco's as a delivery driver. And Ben is one of many pilots who have had to do whatever they had to do simply to earn money during this very difficult period. So some of you have moved already into different sectors and you've taken, if you like, stopgap jobs to keep the money coming in. Some of you quite simply have not been able to find work at all. And some of you are waiting out the storm. So about 15% of you said that you were waiting for the sector to recover before starting to think about moving into a new opportunity. So moving on, we asked the question of the people we surveyed, and we said, well, what percentage of you are currently in an interview process? And so 3%, only 3% of you that are currently unemployed are in an actual interview process. So 3% of pilots who are unemployed are in an actual interview process. So this gives you a good indication of how difficult the recruitment market is for pilots. There's very few vacancies and there's huge competition for the vacancies that are out there. I think it's fair to say that employers really can pick and choose around the people who they employ during this period. And companies, certainly the companies that we've recruited for during this period and that we're recruiting pilots for still currently, they're being very, very selective, really, really picky about their requirements and making sure that people either meet or exceed their requirements. So this 3% of people in interview processes is a really important statistic. And it's a very important statistic because for us as a recruitment business, and for you as pilots who obviously are concerned about your careers, this is a leading indicator. You know, it's a statistic to watch over the coming months and see what happens to this percentage of people who are in interview processes. So moving on, we asked the question of pilots who were out there. You know, this is a very bleak market, very, very tough right now. What sacrifices will pilots make to secure their next opportunity? And 82% of unemployed pilots told us that they would take a pay cut to secure a new opportunity as a pilot. So I guess there's a big element here of kind of needs must when the devil drives. You know, that if you're unemployed and you need to get back into a job, you know, you've got to do whatever you've got to do to get back into employment. But we saw some differences even in the answer to this question. So, for example, first officers told us that they would much more readily take a pay cut than unemployed captains. For example, pilots in North America told us that they were the least willing to take a pay cut. Now, I think that might be in part a reflection of the US and Canada and pilots who fly in North America, perhaps being slightly, and I use slightly with a capital S, slightly less impacted by the COVID pandemic. Obviously, US and Canada has a very large domestic aviation sector, and I think their domestic sector has been slightly less impacted than other regions that have been more impacted. So that might reflect in why North American pilots are less willing to take a pay cut. Pilots in the Middle East and pilots in Africa who are flying those regions, they were the most willing to take a pay cut. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, pilots flying those locations have been very hard hit. Still, 18% of pilots were unemployed. They said, no, actually, you know, we're not going to take a pay cut. We're not prepared. And we're going to dig in. So that's quite interesting as a statistic in itself. I think the wider question here is, it's a bit of a buyer's market for airlines and possibly will be for a little while yet. And the question is, will airlines take advantage of this as the sector recovers? You know, probably some will. And I guess what we'll see is we'll see others who don't. You know, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the coming months. So I think that's quite interesting in itself. So we went on to ask those pilots who are still employed, we asked you and said, well, you know, you're still employed, how concerned are you about job security? And so 82% of you told us that you are concerned about your job security. So understandably, pilots who are on furlough are especially worried. So 95% of the pilots who are onto this, who are on furlough, they were especially worried. And this is understandable, worried mostly if they'll have a job to go back to as furlough comes to an end, or they have an opportunity to return to. But, you know, when we surveyed you pre-COVID, more than half of you at that point, we surveyed you back at the end of 2019, and with FlightGlobal, we produced a report about 12 months ago. 12 months ago, pre-COVID, something like 51% of you back then were still worried about job security. But that's obviously accelerated hugely because of the COVID pandemic. We looked more closely at what the big areas of concern were. You know, why are you worried about job security? And again, unsurprisingly, COVID figured as the biggest reason. But secondly, company financial troubles. You know, the companies you work for and the financial security of the companies that you work for were big areas of concern, and that really worried you. What was interesting here was there was a lot of commentary from pilots who provided us with kind of anecdotal evidence around a lack of feedback and a lack of communication from airlines was really worrying you. So pilots who were employed in flying and pilots who were furloughed, some pilots reported that they were just getting no feedback at all and no communication at all from their employers. And that lack of communication and lack of kind of clarity there was really worrying for those pilots around what would happen going forward. So we went on to ask the pilots who are still employed how valued you felt by your employer. And nearly 50% of you told us that you feel less valued than normal. So COVID has obviously been brutal for pilots, but it's also been brutal for airlines as well. Airlines have had to take drastic measures during this period. And of course, you know, we've read about the redundancies. You guys out there have experienced the redundancies, and these airlines have had to make some really tough calls just to survive this period. But I think it's fair to say what we hear is some airlines have handled these redundancies and these layoffs better than others. And I think it's fair to say that where airlines have put pilots on furlough, some of those airlines have handled that really well and have given clear, regular communication and kept their pilots informed and updated, even though they're on furlough, about what's happening. But we also hear that some airlines have done quite a bad job of that, and some have had no communication at all. So whilst everyone is kind of making this up as we go, in the eyes of pilots, I think it's fair to say there will be winners and losers. And I think this reflects in how pilots feel and how you feel about the airlines and the employers that you work for. And I think it will be interesting because as we come out the other side of this, we will see disengaged pilots, I think, vote with their feet. And I think pilots will remember how they've been treated and how they've been looked after or not during this period. And I think that will reflect in how pilots feel and what pilots do as we come out the other side of this. So we went on to ask pilots about their careers and really how they felt about their careers. And one of the questions that we asked was, if you would choose a pilot career again, so if you had your time again, would you choose to be a pilot if you had the chance? So an interesting question. And bearing in mind the aviation world which we currently live in, and how badly impacted aviation has been impacted by COVID, the answer was a big surprise. 64% of pilots, 64% of you said, yes, if I had my time again, actually I would be a pilot. I would follow this career path again. But interestingly, for pilots who are flying in Europe, 40% of you said, no, actually I wouldn't choose to be a pilot again. And if I had my time again, I wouldn't have done it. And so we looked a little bit more closely at what were the reasons behind this, what were the common themes. And so the sort of themes that the survey and the report pick up on, and what you told us was, it was things like stress and the level of stress that you experience as a pilot. There was a lot of commentary about reward and about how over the years, pilots feel that reward has reduced for the level of responsibility that they have as pilots. There was, of course, a lot of feedback about job security. Work-life balance was an important factor, and the impact of being a pilot and that career path has on family life. So these were all common threads for why pilots said to us, actually, no, I wouldn't repeat this career choice. So I guess, interestingly, either you pilots are kind of, what I would say is gluttons for punishment, or you must really love flying. And I think it's probably the latter, thus the slide. I think you pilots absolutely really love flying, and that's why you would repeat this as a career choice. So we went on to ask you about your stress levels. And we asked you how you would rate your stress levels on a normal day. And we asked this same question in last year's report as well, in the survey and the report. And we asked pilots to rate their level of stress on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being not very stressed, and 5 being very stressed, bearing in mind this is on a normal day. And overall, you told us that your stress level was 3. So this is a half-point increase from last year, which is quite significant on a scale of 1 to 5. A half-point increase from 2.5 to 3 is actually quite a big increase in the level of stress. So we look more closely at the statistics behind this. So interestingly, pilots who are flying in China and pilots who are flying in the Middle East, you told us that you were the most stressed. So some 45% of pilots in China and 32% of pilots flying in the Middle East reported stress levels of 4 or 5. Bearing in mind the maximum here is 5. So pilots flying in China and pilots flying in the Middle East, you're telling us that you're really stressed out, which is really worrying. At the other end of the scale, it seems like pilots flying in North America, you're pretty chilled out. So you're the least stressed. Pilots flying in North America, 59% of you rated your stress levels as only a 1 or a 2. So it seems like North America and pilots operating and flying in North America, much less stress levels. So we asked pilots what it was that was making them stressed, and you told us that 47% of you told us that it was job security. And so obviously COVID, the pandemic, this whole job security piece is a huge contributor to the stress that pilots experience, with 47% saying job security was a contributor for stress. 25% of you said it was COVID. And this was, reading the commentary, this was about catching COVID, this was about passing COVID to your families, this was about going in and out of airports all around the world. but particularly it was pilots in Europe and flying in Europe who were the most stressed by COVID. 10% of you said that management was a contributor to your stress levels. And when we looked more closely at the kind of age demographics in the profile itself, it was pilots who were aged between 35 and 44 years old who were the most stressed. So some really interesting questions around stress. Now we know that being a pilot is a stressful job already. We know being a pilot is a high consequence job, if you like. There's a lot of responsibility rests on your shoulders. But these statistics, these numbers that have come from the survey, I think are particularly worrying. So we went on to talk and look a little bit and ask a little bit about mental health. And so we wanted to know, how has the pandemic affected your mental health? So you've already told us that you're stressed, and clearly being stressed is going to have a big impact on your mental health. We know that being a pilot is stressful, but 40% of you said to us that your mental health has been affected by the pandemic. And there was an absolute raft of commentary from pilots who provided additional feedback in the report, in the survey, and then it's gone into the report, about mental health and how they feel that they've been impacted by the pandemic. I think the impact here on pilots has been huge. Interestingly, when we looked again at the data, it was younger pilots who are most stressed. So I'm not sure if this is kind of generational, in so much as that younger pilots perhaps are more prepared to talk about mental health and talk about their stress levels. I'm not sure whether this is kind of mental health is on the agenda more for younger pilots, or is it perhaps that younger pilots feel that they've been impacted more by the pandemic? Older pilots told us that they were less stressed. So just 32% of 55 to 64-year-old pilots said they were impacted by the pandemic. So just to repeat that, 32% of 55 to 64-year-old pilots said that they were impacted. So actually older pilots really are not that stressed. So I guess the question there is, older pilots going through the current COVID pandemic, this is not their first rodeo, if you like. Many of the older pilots provided commentary around that they'd been through SARS, they'd been through the global financial crisis, they'd been through 9/11, they'd experienced this before, and they kind of knew what to expect. And so is it that they've been through this before? Is it that older pilots are more resilient? Or is it simply that older pilots are less likely to talk about their mental health because of the stigmas around mental health and kind of the generational considerations of mental health? And I think there's some interesting kind of digging in to do, if you like, around mental health and the impact of the pandemic. A third of you, 1/3 of you, told us that you're considering changing careers away from being a pilot. So I guess there's some interesting groups of people here who would fall into this category, into this third. So some of you will feel that you don't have a choice here, that you've got mortgages to pay, you've got mouths to feed, you need to put food on the table, and you don't have a choice. You can't be unemployed. You need to go out and get a job and earn money. And so some of you will feel that you have to move away and change career from being a pilot. Some of you will choose to. And some of you will say, okay, well, actually, I don't think this is going to get better for a little while, and I'm going to choose to move away from being a pilot and change careers. Perhaps low-hour pilots in particular who haven't been able to bridge the gap, they will feel that there is no short-term opportunity and that they won't have a choice. They're going to have to change careers because of this. And I think it's fair to say that some pilots simply will have said that they've had enough. Some of you will return, and this will be a temporary measure, and you'll go off and do other things just to earn money, and you'll come back to it. And I guess that it's fair to say that the impact of that 1/3 of pilots who leave the industry and do something else today. We won't feel the impact of that right now, but we will feel the impact of that in the future. And so then finally, we went on to ask you about the future of aviation. A lot of really interesting information came up in the survey, and we put it into the report about what you think is going to happen here about the future of aviation, and specifically what's going to happen to pilots and careers of pilots. So 72% of you told us that you thought the sector will make a full recovery in 1 to 3 years. So 72% of you feel quite optimistic that in the next 1 to 3 years that the sector's going to come back and it's going to be okay. Interestingly, 43% of you think that actually there will be a shortage of experienced pilots within 5 years. So really interesting to capture those two big headline statistics around what you think is going to happen going forward. I'd like to just finish up by sharing kind of my view, if you like, or our view of what we think is going to happen. You know, we're heavily invested in the aviation sector. We're here for the long term. Running an aviation recruitment business and running a business that has a big emphasis on recruiting pilots, you know, I've kind of got a big bet on here as well. And so I'd like to share with you kind of what I think will happen. So I think the first thing is the sector is quickly, in my opinion, going to go full circle, and we'll be back, as that 43% of you said, and that there will be not enough pilots. We're going to go from too many pilots, full circle, to not enough pilots. Many of you will have read the 2020 Boeing report that talks about 763,000 new pilots needed in the next 20 years. A massive number of pilots. People will continue to fly. People are going to want to go on holiday again. Travel will return. And I think it's fair to say that that will reflect in the demand for pilots. So I think the lasting impact of this pandemic, unfortunately, will be those pilots at the beginning of their careers and those pilots at the end of their careers. So many low-hour pilots will never bridge the gap, and they will leave aviation and we'll never see them again. We've got a lot of pilots and a lot of aviation professionals who are very close to retirement. Many will choose to retire early and decide that they're going to hang up their boots. I've had a good career. I've been through a few storms. This is the final storm. I haven't got left to work. I'm going to retire and leave early. We've already identified that right now, approximately 1/3 of pilots are thinking about or are changing careers. Some of those pilots will return, but many never will return to aviation. Aviation right now has a bit of an image problem, and I think it's fair to say that there will be, I think, a shortage going forward of ab initio cadets. You know, we heard Belper recently telling pilots to postpone training, and Bank of Mum and Dad, I think, are probably not going to be quite so keen to pay for their sons and daughters to be self-funded pilots in the current world. And I think that will contribute, with all of this, to there being a future shortage of pilots at all levels. I think that supply and demand will ultimately reflect in future pilot wages. I think we've got a tough period still ahead of us. I think that we might see a dip in wages for pilots in the short term, but I think actually in the medium term, it will be okay. And I think we'll see it start to go back up, and I think we'll see that supply and demand start to balance out, and we'll be back to having a shortage of pilots. I think, as Sam touched on in the introduction, the good news is that we're already starting to have meaningful conversations at Goose with airlines who are talking about and planning to restart their pilot recruitment this year, which is fantastic news. Fantastic news for you pilots, and fantastic news for someone who runs a recruitment business. And so I think this is pretty good. What I've learned about you pilots in the time that we've worked in this space is you're a resilient bunch. My advice to you is to hang in there, and it will get better.
Mark, thank you so much for that. That's fascinating stuff. We're going to take some questions now from that resilient bunch. Some of these, I think you've touched on briefly, Mark and Sam, and I just wanted to maybe just give you the opportunity to expand on some of the stuff you've talked about when you answer some of these questions. We've had over 35 questions in so far, so in the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to try and cover as many as possible. So maybe keep the answers reasonably brief so we can get through as many questions as possible. I'm going to come back to you, Samantha, first of all. You talked at the end of your presentation about the survey was obviously done at the tail end of last year. This is a never-changing, ever-evolving situation.
Absolutely.
Anecdotally, you were talking about some green shoots, some evidence you've seen. I've got a question here from a member of the audience who's just asking if you could perhaps just elaborate on that a little bit. Mark, you touched on it as well. Just what some of these green shoots are. Pilots are very, very keen to see these green shoots and see where these jobs are coming from. Are we talking about this quarter, towards the end of this year? When do you think these jobs are going to start reappearing?
I would say heavily from summer onwards, from the conversations that I'm having, but recently we're speaking with an airline, of course this is globally, that they'll be starting their campaign from March. So it's across the board. I'm not saying it's tomorrow, I'm not saying it's this week, but certainly, as mentioned previously, there was literally, it was almost like a pause, as we all did. We didn't know how to react, what to do. Whereas now we've got a bit more of a focus. We have some sort of reactions to what's happening. We have the vaccine. Therefore, they can strategically plan the ongoing mission. So when I spoke to an airline recently, a large airline, they said they're really pleased with the summer bookings. As you can appreciate, they've exceeded what they had before. I've spoke to this airline previously, and it wasn't looking great. So that's what I mean in the conversations I'm having. It's completely different, and they're starting to put pen to paper in a sense and plan where they're hiring. And I just want to add on there, Murdo, a lot of airlines that I have spoken with, sort of, I think a first point of call would be welcoming back the pilots that have been furloughed, that have been laid off. So I think that's their first point of call across the board. They'd be going back out to their group and then out to everybody else.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that, Samantha. Mark, you touched on at the end there that perhaps the two groups or demographics that are probably going to be most affected long term in this crisis, the guys starting their careers and perhaps the ones coming to the end. And I'm going to sort of merge two questions here from someone from both these demographics, and just to see what your advice is. So we've got one question about someone who's I presume it's someone who's going to be starting pilot training. Maybe they know someone or going to be funding someone who's going to be starting pilot training. Is it now a good idea to start pilot training, or should they hold off until the recovery comes? And I'm just going to combine that with the other end, if you like. This is a pilot in his or her 50s with more than 17,000 hours. Are they going to get a job again? Or is it best for them to think about, as you said, calling it a day?
Yeah, excellent. Both good questions, and thank you for the questions. So Murdo, I think the pilot who's starting out, I think that's an interesting question, because if you think that it takes between 2 and 5 years to go from someone who has no flying experience at all to being someone who's ready really to join the industry and has done all 14 modules, and they've gone all the way through the process and they're ready to start work. So if we look forward 2 to 5 years, then a lot of the forecasts suggest, and our belief is, that actually the aviation sector will be in pretty good shape. And so if you look ahead and you're prepared to take that investment, yes, there's a risk associated with it, but there was a risk associated with becoming a pilot before. If it's something you're passionate about and you really want to do, and you're planning that in 2 to 5 years, and it's more likely to be closer to the 5 than the 2, that you're going to be joining the aviation sector, I think actually your timing could be quite good. So I think my advice would be go for it. There's never a perfect time to do any of these things, but looking ahead, I think that actually your timing will be okay, because I think you'll be coming into an aviation sector that should be well post-pandemic. and actually in a sector that we're starting to see a shortage of, and this is the key word, the shortage of experienced pilots. And of course, today, whether we went the clock back pre-COVID, it was a shortage of experienced pilots that the industry faced, and it wasn't a shortage of low-hour or entry-level pilots. So my advice, press on, go for it, and I think your timing could be okay. To the pilot who is closer to retirement, I think the question there is around depending how close that pilot is to retirement. But I think that the closer you are to retirement, there's still a lot of jobs out there. And we've seen a lot of very experienced pilots go to Asia, for example, to fly. And they've taken 12, 24, 36-month contracts in Asia that have been very well paid, where they have a shortage of that experience, and many Asian airlines were prepared to pay for that experience. And that, if you're flexible, I think that could be a good option for a pilot closer to retirement. Of course, if you want to go and fly in China, then you've got to make sure that you stay very fit and you stay very healthy, because you've got to get through a very stringent medical to fly in China. But of course, we've all heard the stories of pre-COVID of the sort of salaries that people have been able to earn as pilots in China.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question, Mark, that you touched on, which was the likely impact on TNCs, on terms and conditions, on pilot pay. I'm going to combine another couple of questions that we've had and then paraphrase them as well. But obviously, in a supply and demand situation that we have, there's going to be pressure on TNCs, downward pressure on TNCs, you would have thought. What is your view, short term and longer term, on how terms and conditions for pilots will evolve?
Yeah, so if I had to put a timeline against it, I think probably for the next 24 months, we're going to see that pressure, that downward pressure on wages. Most of the forecasters and most of the stuff that you read about the aviation sector and how it will return strongly suggests that the domestic aviation sector, whether that's in Europe or Asia or North America, wherever it might be, that it will be the domestic sector that returns the strongest and returns more quickly, and that the long-haul aviation sector will take longer to recover and to come back. And I think what we'll see is, we'll see a bit of a lag. And I think that for the next 12 to 24 months, I think that we're either going to see downward pressure on wages, or I think if we're lucky, we might see wages remain static. The kind of question, or the factor that will drive that, is how quickly airlines start recruiting again. And do they start recruiting people who are on furlough and pulling those people back in, which is of course what they'll do first. And then the pilots who are unemployed, who are out there, 82% of them said that they would take a pay cut just to get back into work. Until that kind of excess supply of experienced pilots is absorbed, there's going to be pressure on wages. I think that will quite quickly start to go the other way, and that as soon as we start to experience a shortage of pilots again, and this will be about experienced pilots, that wages will start to increase and we'll start to see kind of things level out again.
Okay. I've got another question here, and again, you touched on this, but perhaps you could just be a bit more specific on, you talked there a bit about long haul and business travel and short haul, but did you get any impression from the findings about the difference that pilots who have been working for different types of airlines, so commuter operators, low-cost airlines, perhaps corporate operations, how are certain sectors being differently affected by this crisis?
Yeah, good question. So based on our own experience and what we've seen in recruiting pilots during this period, and also recruiting other aviation professionals as well, because recruiting other aviation professionals, whether that's engineering or whether it's operations and kind of other stuff that's non-flying, is a good indication of how companies in the aviation sector feel about their own confidence, their own market going forward. And so the two areas that we've seen hold up quite well during this period has been cargo airlines. And the cargo airline piece has been widely reported as a pretty robust sector. during this period, and we've seen some big operators in the cargo space who've actually gone out and hired pilots during this period. And we've had clients who've used this as an opportunity to run campaigns and to recruit, for example, 747 pilots who've come out of the airlines who have mothballed the 747, who've moved across to the cargo sector and have done very well. And so the cargo space has held up and been pretty resilient. The business jet space has also held up surprisingly well during this period. And whilst the business jet operators are again very specific about their requirements, they're very specific about what they want and what they don't want for the people that they employ, it's been quite robust. And then of course, general aviation, instructors, that whole piece there, it's been okay, not brilliant, but not as impacted perhaps as the mainstream airline piece itself.
Okay, got lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and get through them as much as possible. This is one, maybe Sam, you'd like to come in on this one. Do you see a role as the industry recovers? Will it be more of a role for agency pilots, for freelance pilots? Is that a route that maybe some pilots could look to get back into the market as the industry begins to recover?
Potentially, yes. And if anything, I would say in the interim period, so in the closer period that's coming up, where airlines may not want to commit to permanent members of staff because we're all a little bit shaky from what happened. So there's certainly a space there for contracts, fixed term contracts, which may help both the pilot, because, for example, we have pilots contracting at the moment, maybe in roles which isn't their fundamental role where they want to be, but it's filling the gap. So I think sort of for the near period, I believe that will be certainly a market and a sector for that, for both airline and the pilots.
I think what I'd add there, Sam, is that it's really about the strength of the recovery. And I think that the key reason why airlines and employers in the aviation sector will look to using pilots on a contract or temporary basis really is about confidence. And I think it's going to be about the speed and the robustness of the recovery and how airlines feel about that recovery that will determine that, because many of them, as you quite rightly point out, they've been really battered and bruised during this period, and they're going to want flexibility coming out the other side, and they will perceive that that flexibility may come from having a kind of more flexible workforce, and having pilots on contract could be an important part of that. And I think, Murdo, over the next 12-month period, that will start to shape up and we'll start to see what really happens there.
Okay, we've had a few questions come in on this theme. So again, I'm going to try and paraphrase and combine a few together, but we've seen lots of coverage about the challenges with parking aircraft for a long time and bringing them back into service. The same thing applies to pilots who've perhaps haven't been sat in the cockpit for, let alone a simulator for maybe 12 months, maybe longer by the time this is over. What are some of the issues around these pilots coming back to work, both in terms of just the actual rules and regulations about becoming current again, but also perhaps, psychologically, their confidence, getting back on the bike, getting back in the saddle, whatever the expression is. It's a long time not to be doing your job and coming back. What are some of the issues around that? And perhaps what would your advice be as well?
I have a little bit of advice on the sort of going back into work, in a sense, more the psychological side, Murdo. Ourselves here, we would be here to support you and help you throughout that process, especially individuals who've been in their role for many years and sort of this is the first time they've been without a job. So the process may be all new to them again. So we'll be here to support them and hold your hand, in a sense, throughout that process. As we all know, it's not a one-stop shop interview for a pilot role. There's assessment process, and also you want to understand the airline that you're going to work for, the setup. We'll tell you about the location if you're looking to sort of relocate for the position. So as far as concerned as sort of your partner, your agency, we would really support you in that process and hopefully make you feel confident on your journey to get you back into work and do what you love doing. I don't know if you want to add to that, Mark?
Well, I think that you make a good point. Many of these pilots who've lost their jobs Many of them have been employed for very long periods by their previous airline. You know, we had a pilot who was saying to us that they'd been with their airline for 20 years and now they'd lost their job. And last time he went to an interview was 20 years ago. And so, you know, some of these pilots, understandably, they're feeling pretty battered themselves and lacking in confidence. You know, I haven't been through an interview process for a long time. Now many of the interview processes are on video like this today. Well, that takes some getting used to in its first place. And the whole process, you know, is quite, I think it's quite scary for someone who hasn't been through it, either in the current format, because 20 years ago it was very different to what it is today, or for someone who simply hasn't worked for a long period of time. It's tough. But I think, as Sam said, it's in our interest to help you to be the best version of yourself. We want to help you get the job. It's in our interest to have successful pilots who get jobs, and metaphorically and physically, if needed, we'll hold your hand through the process. You know, that's what we're here for.
Well, that's good. That's good to know, I'm sure, for a lot of pilots. I've got a question here. It's more of as much of an observation as a question, but it goes back to the bit in the survey about stress and mental health, and the fact that older pilots perhaps seem to be less affected than younger pilots. And this member of the audience is asking, well, you know, is that just because when pilots are a bit older, they've been in the job longer, they're closer to retirement, they're perhaps a lot more financially secure than younger pilots who are embarking on this career, not as well rewarded, and have got a long career ahead of them and a lot of uncertainty ahead of them? Is it perhaps a factor? Is that a factor, or is it more about a generational attitude?
So I think this is pretty much multifaceted, and I think you'll see across this quite a broad spectrum of reasons why pilots are going to feel this way. Some pilots who are older and more experienced, they tell us anecdotally, and we hear through their commentary in the survey and the report, that they say, well, look, I've been through SARS, I've been through 9/11, I've been through the global financial crisis, and okay, so COVID is a bit different to all of those, and is probably worse than all of those put together. But the reality is I've been through all of those before, and I know what to expect. I know that we're going to have a tough period. I know that it's going to be brutal for a period of time ahead of us, but actually it's going to get better, and I'm going to hang in there and remain optimistic, and I'll come out the other side of this and I'll be okay. So I think that's an element of that. I think there is an element of generational aspects to this, which is that younger people are more willing and perhaps readily able to talk about their mental health and talk about their stress levels. And as a father with, you know, kind of young adult children, you know, and experiencing this whole thing, I see this and I understand that it's on the agenda much more for young people than it is perhaps for my generation and older. And so I think there is a generational aspect to it as well. I think there is also, Modo, and I think you make a very good point, there is an aspect here, which is that perhaps pilots who are closer to retirement, perhaps they're more financially sorted. You could argue perhaps they have more commitments and financial outgoings because of where they're at in life. But a lot of young pilots, especially those pilots who've self-funded to become a pilot in the first place, they've invested, what, 120, 130,000 pounds to become a pilot. They might still have quite low hours, and they've either only just kind of bridged the gap or they're in the process of bridging the gap, and now this has happened, and wow, now they're really stressed about, I've spent all this money to become a pilot and the timing's terrible, now I've lost my job, and I know previously there was a shortage of experience. I'm not very experienced as a pilot because I've only got low hours. What am I going to do? So you can see both sides of it, and I think it's quite a complex situation that's very individual specific.
Okay. A huge issue for those of us in the UK, Brexit. A lot of questions about Brexit, but one very specific one. Will Brexit, the UK leaving the European Union, which it now has, of course, have any impact on pilots from the UK getting jobs in the future in EU countries?
It's Certainly going to be a little bit more tricky, as you can imagine. Of course, we're waiting for the guidelines to be published from the CAA, and we're watching closely on that, just to give us some more concrete answers. We wouldn't want to sort of suggest things that aren't going to happen, but it's certainly going to make things a bit more tricky. I know individuals that are already employed and have been working in Europe from the UK up until now, up until April, it's not a problem. The employer can help them obtain their visa. But moving forward from April, there are going to be a few more obstacles. So in all honesty, it's not going to be as straightforward, but yet not impossible. I think it will be a case-by-case basis by the airlines themselves, what they are committed to do and what they are prepared to support with in relation to visas, etc.
I think that the thing to remember here is that this cuts both ways. And so whilst in the short term, it may be more difficult for UK pilots to fly in Europe or go and work in Europe and live in Europe and fly for European airlines, it's also more difficult for European pilots to come and live in the UK and fly for UK airlines as well. And so I think it cuts both ways. I think the reality of this is that, as Sam said, in the short term, it might be a bit painful whilst we kind of all figure this out and work our way through it. But actually going forward, I think it will settle down. It will be okay. I think that, EASA and the Civil Aviation Authority, and I think the whole piece around work permits and people kind of overcoming this, I think we'll get there. I think we just might go through a bit of a tough period over the next few months just to get through that period.
Sure. Okay. We're just about at the end of our time. I'm just going to try and fit in one more question. And again, I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have come in. So one is about the green reset and flight shaming and all the stuff that was very vogue before COVID about, the future aviation, or the next generation going to be avoiding aviation because of its carbon impact on the earth. And another question really about technology and the possibility of one pilot cockpits in future, perhaps even automated cockpits where you don't even need a pilot. What are some of your thoughts, perhaps, on we're perhaps going beyond a year or two as we come out of the crisis, but what are your thoughts beyond that as to the future of aviation and what the impact of these factors will be?
I think that the whole green agenda is not going away, and it's fair to say that aircraft have got to be greener and greener and greener, and the whole aviation sector is slowly starting to embrace that and recognise that it's actually something that's here, it's real, and it's something that we need to deal with today. It was interesting. I was having my lunch today, and having my lunch in the kitchen, and my wife's reading the paper, and she said, "Mark, you're doing your thing this afternoon, aren't you? The webinar as a guest." She said, "Well, have you seen this article in the Times about?" It was something about a hydrogen powered pilotless aircraft that I think. Someone like Norman Britton or Britton Norman, whoever they are, the people who make the island.
Yeah, I think it was GK.
I think it was something about that. And she said, "Are you going to talk about that as part of your webinar?" I said, "Well, I'm not, but the whole pilotless or one pilot or unmanned aircraft, that whole piece, it's coming. It's not going away. In our lifetimes and in our generations, are we going to start to get on aircraft and go on holiday where there's no pilot or there's only one pilot? I'm not so sure. I think that that remains to be seen. Sam, would you add anything to that at all?
I think I'd mirror your opinion there, Mark, and it's on a personal opinion as well. Would I want to be in an aircraft that has no pilot? So I think I'd agree with you. It's obviously something in the far off future, but not maybe in our lifetime.
So pilots aren't going to be replaced by robots just yet, which is
I hope not.
Good thing, because
I don't think so.
They need the jobs to come back. Listen, that's great. That just about takes us to the end of our allocated time. Whether you're an affected pilot or not, we hope that this has given you some insights into how the worldwide community of commercial aviators has been affected by the COVID-19 downturn. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to more of your questions. We had lots and lots of questions come in. So we tried to get through as many as possible within the hour and could only do so many. So thank you all for contributing. But to read more about the survey findings or to download your own copy of the report, you can go to FlightGlobal.com or to the homepage of GOOSE Recruitment, which is goose-recruitment.com. We hope to see you again at the next Flight Global webinar. on the 11th of February, which is part of our series on sustainable aviation. We touched on that subject there at the end. We'll be debating disruptive propulsion. So in the meantime, thank you again to Samantha and Mark, and to all of you for joining us today. Goodbye, good luck, and stay safe.